So we come to the fifth part of this series, and once again, as I did in part 2, I am going to take you all the way back to the 18th century, to the days of the French Revolution. And there is a reason why we need to go back there. It is because the way of thinking that we are analyzing in this series was born back then, and hasn't changed at all in the centuries that passed since. It just keeps popping up again and again in different guises, like Dracula that keeps on getting defeated and put back in his grave, but always comes back. In this episode, we are going to take a more in-depth look at this history. The Age of Enlightenment presented the rejection of the old idea that monarchs are the sovereign of the land because they were ordained by God, and that people should be divided into classes. Instead, it asserted that the sovereign should be the entire nation, a body made of equal peers. The first major text to present this idea was Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan, published in 1651, in which he argues that all humans are egocentric and aggressive beings, and therefore they group together under a social contract to create an all-powerful state that will rule over them, and protect them from each other. Reading it now, we see that Hobbes' vision has a lot of problems, the biggest being that he did not really consider the possibility that the state itself might become oppressive. But it served as a basis to build on, and in the century and a half that followed, many philosophers and jurists discussed the problems he left open, and found good solutions. By the time the American founding fathers sat down to write their constitution, they were already able to draft a document that has been the template for a republic of free people that has endured to this very day. One of the people who developed these ideas was the French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, but unfortunately, he also developed some ideas that led to unwanted results. In the opening lines of his book The Social Contract, Rousseau famously announces that man is born free, and everywhere is in chains. By that, he means that the nature of man is to live in a free society, but all the existing ruling systems do not manifest this nature, so the people are oppressed. Unlike Hobbes, Rousseau believed that the nature of man is good, and it is the current environment that twists it and makes him do bad things. In a wholesome system, people will be allowed to realize their true nature, and then they will live in a truly free, equal and peaceful society. But how do we create this perfect system? For that, said Rousseau, the people themselves must convene and create the laws, and they must do so according to the general will. The general will is something that all humans have, and it is distinguished from the particular will. The particular will is irrational and egotistic, containing desires and personal aspirations. The general will is when the individual uses their rationality to think about the common good. This is typical of the philosophers of Enlightenment, the idea that each of us has a particular side, which makes us unique, and a universal side, which we share with all humans. Rationality, believe the philosophers of Enlightenment, is universal, so Rousseau asserts that it can be used to make laws that are good for everyone. No one is capable of completely detaching from the particular will and thinking only rationally, but when the entire nation gets together and they all think rationally, they can come up with laws that are compatible with man's good nature. A society based on such laws will be a peaceful society, where everyone will live freely and equally, without oppression, poverty or crime. In previous episodes, we distinguished between the liberal left and the radical left. We said that they both want to change society to be more compatible with the ideals of Enlightenment, but while liberals believe that human nature is imperfect and therefore we can never achieve a fully enlightened society, the radical left believes that human nature is to live in Utopia, and if we only fix the system, Utopia will prevail. We see now that the liberal view has its roots in Hobbes, whereas the radical view is rooted in Rousseau. But it should be noted that Rousseau's work contains many nuances, and is generally skeptical about man's ability to fully live up to the ideal he portrays and achieve Utopia. Alas, radicals don't do nuance, and Rousseau's ideas became the source of a lot of misery in the years that followed, as was first displayed in the French Revolution. The French Revolution happened shortly after the American Independence War, but while the Americans built their country on the basis provided by English thinkers like Hobbes and Locke, the French Revolution took place under the shadow of Rousseau, and it showed in the results. At first, it started with the common people demanding a place in the National Assembly, and representation which will be equal to that of the other two classes, the nobility and the clergy. But pretty soon, that wasn't enough either. While the people of the countryside still had sympathy for the king and the clergy, the people of the capital Paris were inspired by Rousseau's ideas, and believed that there should be no classes. This led to the 1789 revolution, which forced King Louis XVI to acknowledge that the people are now the new sovereign over the land, and the nobility and clergy must join them as equals. The new National Assembly decreed that all the prisoners should be released, since they were seen as victims of the previous oppressive system, and the belief was that pretty soon, once the new laws made by the general will shall be in place, there will be no crime, no need for prisons, and no more need for the death sentence. The National Convention, the new legislative and executive body, was made of two main camps, which determined how we perceive politics to this very day. On the right-hand side sat the Girondins, who believed that the transition should be gradual. They wanted to temporarily keep some of the old order, and make good laws that will lead to the eventual emergence of the ideal society. They also believed that the government should interfere as little as possible in the economy. On the left-hand side sat the Jacobins, who were committed to implementing Rousseau's vision. They wanted to eradicate all signs of the old order, and to have a strong government that will impose the new laws and force the perfect order on the people, believing that this will lead to the immediate emergence of Utopia. The Girondins, who had the support of the countryside, were the majority at first, and set the tone, but the Jacobins, led by their two great ideologues Louis-Antoine de Saint-Just and Maximilien Robespierre, had the support of the people of the capital, and since the convention was in Paris, that gave them the edge. King Louis XVI, at first, was allowed to keep his position as a constitutional monarch, but when he was caught conspiring with the enemies of the Republic, his fate was sealed. The Girondins wanted to try for the crime itself, but Robespierre and Saint-Just had a different idea. They wanted to judge him for the crime of being a monarch, and thus acting against the natural order as described by the philosophers of Enlightenment. It didn't matter that Louis was king by virtue of the previous order, an order that existed for centuries. There's only one natural order, and since Louis XVI put himself above it, he had to die. Robespierre, who until then was strongly opposed to the death sentence, consoled himself that this would be the last death sentence that they would have to give, since now that the last remnant of the old order is gone, the new perfect order can finally set in, and Utopia will prevail. But things did not get better. They only got worse, and eventually, the people of the capital revolted again, deposed the Girondins and put the Jacobins in power. And it didn't take long before the Jacobins took their ideology to its logical conclusion. Since the only way to achieve Utopia was to impose the perfect order, it meant that anyone opposing this order is a counter-revolutionary who is standing in the way of Utopia. The Girondins were thus sent to the guillotine, for the crime of disagreeing with the Jacobins. The clergy and the aristocracy, remains of the old order, were also counter-revolutionary, so they too had to be eliminated. The reign of terror began. Robespierre was now the de facto ruler of France, and in this capacity, he announced his goal to turn France into what he called a Republic of Virtue. He opens the speech by saying that the aim is to achieve the peaceful enjoyment of liberty and equality, the reign of that eternal justice whose laws are engraved not in stone and marble, but in the hearts of all men, even in the heart of the slave who forgets them or the tyrant who disowns them. So he relies on Rousseau's idea that freedom and equality are in the nature of man, and we want to create a republic based on that nature. He goes on to say that it will be a society where the citizen submits to the magistrate to the people, and the people to justice. Now, you might ask, what is the difference between the citizens and the people? Well, the answer is that the citizens refers to the actual individuals who lived in the republic, whereas the people is that amorphous body made of all of them, a body which Rousseau claimed had a will of its own. We are to be ruled by the general will, the only thing that can rule with justice. Robespierre then carries on to say that we want to fulfill the wishes of nature, accomplish the destiny of humanity, keep the promises of philosophy, absolve providence from the long reign of crime and tyranny. He adds that only a government of the people can do that, but also that such a government should be based on a fundamental principle, that is to say, the essential strength that sustains it and makes it move. What is that principle? Robespierre answers, it is virtue. Virtue, as he describes it, is basically a willingness to commit yourself to the general will. Now that we've established that, Robespierre continues, if the strength of popular government in peacetime is virtue, the strength of popular government in revolution is both virtue and terror. Terror without virtue is disastrous. Virtue without terror is powerless. Virtue, then, gives you legitimacy to act in any way you see fit, because you are acting in the name of the general will. In revolutionary times, when you need to change the system and the way that people think, This means that you are allowed to impose a reign of terror and forcefully instill the ideas of the revolution into the minds of people. It is not immoral, since you are doing it to bring utopia that will justify all you did. The revolution started out by giving more freedom of expression to the people, and was accompanied by the flourishing of free media and political theater. But now, newspapers and plays were heavily censored, and only one opinion was allowed. Any dissenting opinion would send you to the guillotine. Rousseau, as we recall, asserted that the general will is universal, and at the heart of every man. But he also said that every individual has particular will, and he can't completely distinguish between the two. Only when all the people convene together to make the rules, their particular wills cancel each other out, and the general will emerges. Robespierre and Saint-Just forgot that part. They believe that they knew what the general will is, and that this gives them legitimacy to murder. Unfortunately, the utopia that was to validate them did not materialize, and the terror did not get all the people to agree with them. On the contrary, things only kept getting worse, and the dissenting voices grew ever louder, forcing them to enhance the pace of executions. Robespierre became increasingly more paranoid, and anyone who said something slightly out of place could be executed. Eventually, he turned on other Jacobins, and started to brand them as counter-revolutionaries. Fearing for their life, the Jacobins finally rebelled, took control and sent Robespierre and Saint-Just to consummate their relationship with their beloved guillotine. The reign of terror ended after 13 months, during which thousands of people were murdered, all in the name of virtue. Meanwhile, in Germany, the German philosophers of Enlightenment were watching the events of the French Revolution unfold, and trying to figure out what went wrong. The answer they came up with was that it's not enough to change the system, but humans need to change as well. The human race is not enlightened enough yet, so it cannot produce an enlightened society. Out of this insight came the philosophy of Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, which introduced the idea of historical progress into the philosophy of enlightenment, as well as the idea that this progress is dialectic. Like Rousseau, Hegel saw human society as one body, and he actually expanded it and said that all of humanity is one body, whose nature is to live in a state of equality. But unlike Rousseau, he believed that the ability to live in utopia exists in this body only as a potential, which needs to be developed until it realizes that potential. Hegel's philosophy, presented at the beginning of the 19th century, follows the progress of the human spirit through history. According to Hegel, in his initial state man was living in a state of equality, but also in a state where he was dominated by nature. Man wants to dominate nature, so humans came up with ideas about the world, which gave them more control over it. These ideas then formed the basis for a new system, which was divided into a master class and a servant class. But since the nature of humans is to live in equality, they could not be happy in this state, and were driven to change it. In such a state, the master class determines the prevailing worldview, which gives legitimacy to its rule. However, this worldview also contains the components of a better worldview, which negates the current one. These components are thrust on the servant class, seen as something negative, but eventually, someone from the servant class manages to bring them together into a new worldview. Once it spreads to enough human minds, a revolution occurs, which creates a new order based on this worldview. The new order also has a master class and a servant class, but it is less oppressive than the preceding one, and it also contains the components for an even better worldview that will emerge in the future. Thus, through this process of better and better worldviews and systems superseding each other, the human spirit progresses towards the full realization of its potential, both on the ideological level and on the practical level. And, according to Hegel, on the ideological level we have actually reached that point. The worldview of enlightenment is that of a free and equal society, where there are no masters and servants, but everyone is a free individual. So all that is left now is for this worldview to spread to enough minds, and then humanity will create a fully enlightened society. And this is actually how liberal thought sees things to this very day. We believe that the democratic system is the best system, and all that's left to do now is to A. Spread the system to places in the world where it does not yet reside, and B. Educate the citizens to be more and more enlightened. However, there is also a radical way to read Hegel. Some thinkers accept his idea of dialectic progress, but reject his claim that we have reached the pinnacle of that progress. They believe that there are better worldviews out there, better systems than what we have today, and the most prominent of these thinkers was Karl Marx. The philosophy of Marx and Marxism will be discussed in a future episode. Here, We will just say that he claimed that Hegel was wrong to believe that we have reached equality with the democratic state. That is because the capitalist system, the economic system of this democratic state, has created two classes of people: the employers, or the bourgeoisie, and the workers, or the proletariat, who are being exploited because they are not getting paid in accordance with the wealth that they are producing. So we still have a master class and a servant class, and we need one more revolution to achieve utopia. So the working class, for Marx, are the vessel of the general will, and once they supersede the bourgeois oppressors, their will is going to manifest itself in a perfect society. This society will abolish the capitalist system, abolish commodities altogether, and just share the wealth in full equality. The ideas of Hegel and Marx excited generations of youngsters who came in their wake. In the last 2 decades of the 19th century, Europe was rocked by thousands of terrorist attacks, carried out by young people who didn't really have a clear cause they were doing it for. All they knew was that they are helping to destroy the system, and consequently precipitating the coming of the future utopia. Once again, immorality and terrorism were done and justified in the name of virtue, and virtue, this time, meant being dedicated to the progress towards the future utopia. Most of the terrorism occurred in Russia, and this revolutionary spirit led to the Communist Revolution of 1917, which was based on the ideas of Marx. The revolutionaries were initially split into two camps, the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks. The Mensheviks believed in gradual change, in working with other political forces to transform society into a communist utopia. The Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, believed that we must establish a temporary dictatorship of the proletariat, which will indoctrinate the people to be good communists. Once everyone is indoctrinated, utopia will prevail, and there will be no more need for government. This ideology does not allow for the existence of dissenting voices, and since the Bolsheviks were the majority, the Mensheviks were soon outlawed, and given the choice to conform or be eliminated. Leon Trotsky, a Menshevik leader who conformed and became a Bolshevik, warned his former comrades that if they don't do the same, they will find themselves in the dustbin of history. And so, just like in the French Revolution, the state became totalitarian and terroristic. But the term the dustbin of history displays the difference between the Jacobins and the Bolsheviks. In the Jacobin version, virtue meant being dedicated to the perfect order that they were offering. The Bolsheviks, on the other hand, didn't think that they represented the perfect order. They believed that they still had to progress until they reached that point, so virtue for them meant being dedicated to the progress. So while they weren't perfect, at least they were more progressed than others. They were the next stage in the Marxist dialectic, the representatives of the proletariat, so anyone who remained in the previous stage has become a hindrance to progress, on the wrong side of history, and has therefore become redundant. In the coming decades, the Bolsheviks would send to the dustbin of history anyone who they deemed as having reactionary views, or being in a line of work that has no place in the new order. It didn't take long before Trotsky himself was sent by Stalin to the dustbin of history. Once you start down that path, there is only one direction you can go. When you murder in the name of progress, the only thing that can exonerate you is the utopia at the end of the road. So when the utopia fails to materialize, the revolutionaries become ever more desperate, and double down on the terrorism. It's too late now to admit that they were wrong. That would mean that they are nothing but mass murderers. So they must try to force reality to comply with the ideology. If they failed to bring utopia, it was simply because they were not ideologically pure enough, so they must purify themselves more and more. And so, every little transgression becomes an offense for which you must be eliminated. And while the Jacobins couldn't last for long without living up to the pledge of utopia, the Bolsheviks could rely on dialectic thinking to claim that there is still a glorious future awaiting us, and so they could hold on to power for decades. Eventually, history itself was sent to the dustbin of history, as they started to falsify the past to cover their false predictions and promises. In the 20th century, the communist state murdered tens of millions of people, in the Soviet Union, in China and other places, and it was all for naught. Things never got better, they only got horrifically worse. By the middle of the 20th century, it became painfully obvious that Hegel and Marx were simply wrong. You can't find any law that governs history, which will allow you to predict with certainty what the end form of humanity shall be. One of the philosophers who demolished this way of dialectic thinking was Michel Foucault. Writing from the 1950s to the 1980s, Foucault basically agreed with Hegel that every period is ruled by a paradigm that determines the power structure, and that these paradigms succeed one another. But he rejected the idea that there is one rule that is behind the shifts, and which is deterministically leading to a utopian future. Every paradigm determines the boundaries of the possible discourse, but the discourse eventually gets to a point where the paradigm can no longer contain it, so a paradigm shift occurs. But there is a large degree of chance in the process, as every paradigm contains the components not just for one paradigm that might replace it, but for many possible paradigms. Foucault also debunked the belief that human morality is progressing, and showed that our perception of past people as immoral disregards the paradigm that they were in, and that we ourselves are not as moral as we'd like to think. Most importantly for us, Foucault presented a completely different analysis of power relations. Hegel and Marx believed that at the end of history, there will be no more oppression. Foucault does not believe that there is an end to history. We will always be trapped in a paradigm, and there will always be power relations. However, unlike Hegel, he did not believe that there is a ruling class that imposes the paradigm. The paradigm is something that controls all of us, and no one is completely aware of it. And in the age that we are in now, the modern age, power has been decentralized and dispersed to such an extent that we can no longer talk about oppressors and oppressed. Every one of us is oppressed in some ways. All of us are helping to maintain the paradigm that does the oppressing. Foucault's analysis, then, refutes the dialectic theories held by radicals, and validates liberal thinking. Alas, in the wake of Foucault came other thinkers, who took his thought in destructive directions. They accepted that we are ruled by the modern paradigm, but they believed they could break out of it, and so they called themselves postmodernists, a label that was thrust on Foucault as well even though he rejected it. Foucault still saw himself as a philosopher of Enlightenment, which meant that he was still dedicated to the pursuit of truth. He may have rejected the notion that we can find the universal truth that rules everything, but he still created his theories based on a reasoned interpretation of all the facts laid before him. But the postmodernists feel that since he showed that we can't find the universal truth, it means that they don't have to be committed to truth at all, and can create theories meant to further their political agendas. Similarly, while Foucault demystified our pretensions of great moral progress, he still believed in progress, and his philosophy is meant to help us better understand the processes we are ruled by, so that we can devise a better society. The postmodernists, however, took it in the direction of moral relativism, and denied that today's Western society is better than others. Worst of all, the radicals did not give up on their dialectic thought following Foucault's analysis of power, but rather incorporated it and used it as a cloaking device. For instance, when radical feminists talk about the patriarchy, they will pretend to mean it in the Foucault sense, as a dispersed network of power that is oppressing women. But when you dig into their logic, you realize that they are actually talking about a class struggle, in which all the power is in the hands of men. This is what I've defined as regressive left rhetoric, pushing a radical Marxist theory, but using postmodernism to disguise it as liberal. In part 2, we saw how the regressive left created an imaginary pyramid of oppression, based on people's racial, sexual, gender, and religious identities. This pyramid divides humanity into many classes, and seemingly complicates the Marxist dogma. But there is another approach. What is known as intersectional feminism brings all the so-called oppressed groups together, and divides humanity once again into two classes of people. Straight white cis males, which are the oppressor class, and everyone else, which are the oppressed class. And although the regressives don't explicitly say it, this allegedly oppressed class has now become for them what the working class is for the Marxists, the vessel of the future utopia. Let's recap. The idea put forth by Rousseau was that the people are a body with its own will, called the general will, and if we allow this will to create a system, we will have a utopian society. So the French revolutionaries accused the nobility and the clergy, the classes that put themselves above the rest, that they are dividing this body and thus preventing the general will from being manifested. Therefore, these classes had to be eliminated to bring utopia. Marxists basically adopted this idea, except that for them it was the bourgeoisie who are dividing the people and should therefore be eliminated. And now the regressives bring back this idea, except that for them it is the patriarchy that is dividing us. This is very important to understand. While for the rest of us it seems that identity politics are dividing us into many groups, that is not how the regressives see it. They believe that it is the patriarchy that has created these divisions, and they are representing the ideology that wants to overcome these divisions. They are the people, the general will, fighting to create a utopia in which no one will be oppressed based on their identity. This way of thinking emerged in the academy in the last 2 decades, and soon developed all the bad habits we've witnessed in their predecessors. It starts with wanting to eliminate anyone who disagrees with them, anyone whose ideas clash with their ideology. And so they engage in what is known as no platforming, actively preventing these dissenters from having a platform to express their ideas. Here's one example. Charles Murray is a scholar who became notorious for writing The Bell Curve, a book that researches what accounts for difference in intelligence between humans, and names race as one of the contributing factors. It's a controversial argument, but arrived at through valid scientific method. But, of course, this goes against the regressive belief that there are no differences between the races, so Murray was marked for no platforming. Here's how regressives greet him when he is invited to speak at the academy.
Charles Murray, go away! Racist, sexist, anti-gay! Charles Murray, go away! Racist, sexist, anti-gay! Charles Murray, go away!
Many people have pointed out that this chant makes no sense. Murray may be accused of racism, but what do the accusations of being sexist or anti-gay have to do with it? But the people saying that are totally missing the point. These students are not protesting against Murray. They are signaling their virtue. They are showing that they speak in the name of that body that does not differentiate based on race, gender, or sexual orientation. By doubting the natural equality between the races, Murray showed that he is against this body, and that makes him sexist and anti-gay as well. And because they have virtue, because they speak for the general will, that means that they have legitimacy to act in any way they see fit, and use violence to prevent Murray, or any other enemy of the people, from speaking. In Chapter 2, we also pointed out that identity politics was initially a liberal thing. It was true that certain types of identities were holding people back, and preventing them from having equality of opportunity. So we worked to change the situation, and during the Obama years it felt like we have removed the last remaining obstacles, and can now leave identity politics behind and look for other causes. But the regressive leftists perceived it very differently. In the dialectic mindset, when history goes in the way you want it to, that means that your theory was right, and that we are on our way to Utopia. So the recent victories emboldened the regressives, and they believe that they are finally winning against the patriarchy. In 2015, Canada elected the perfect regressive candidate, Justin Trudeau, to be its prime minister, and one of his first acts was to appoint a gender-balanced cabinet. When asked why he did that, he replied,
"Because it's 2015.
For a liberal like me, this was a disheartening moment. I believe that since we now have equality of opportunity, we will eventually reach gender equality in political representation. I believe that given more time, women will find ways to create more successful business models around feminine traits, allowing them to better compete against men in the business world. Once this happens, equal representation in politics will just follow naturally. When we get to that point, it will be a cause for celebration. But we are not there yet, so to watch this smug politician turning this issue into nothing but a signal of his own virtue was nothing short of disgusting. Trudeau didn't even bother to claim that the women he elected for the cabinet deserved to be there based on their merit. He just presents himself as a representative of progress. In that, he basically made Canada look like Saudi Arabia, where the king appoints all members of the parliament and decides beforehand how many of them will be women. This is how much the regressive left has caused our society to regress. But the gig is up. Acts like these only make more and more people wake up to what is going on. One thing that differentiates the regressive left of today from radicals of the past is that it has absolutely nothing to stand on. The Marxists of a century ago could at least point out to real problems that they were fighting against, even if their solutions were bad. Today's identity politics fight against completely imaginary problems, since identity is no longer a cause for oppression in the West. In the previous chapters, we have seen the tactics used by the regressives to hide this fact from the general public, and cause many people to become passive regressives, who support them out of ignorance. But since 2014, liberals have been waking up, and realizing that left-wing politics have been hijacked by radicals. Forming a truce with conservatives, they are now fighting against this menace and beating it back, and the regressives are living on borrowed time. The regressives react as expected. Feeling that the utopia is suddenly being taken away from them, they are reacting with increased desperation and violence to beat their opponents into submitting to their ideology. When Richard Spencer, a white nationalist leader, got sucker punched while giving an interview, the regressive community at large celebrated this act of political violence. They defended it by claiming that there's nothing wrong about punching a Nazi, a claim that a lot of passive regressives sympathize with. But once you make violence a legitimate political instrument, you are allowing the radicals to take it further. Richard Spencer is actually not a Nazi, although you may claim that he is close enough. But once you've allowed that you can punch not just Nazis but also those who are close to Nazis, the question becomes, how close do they have to be? What about, say, Milo Yiannopoulos? Milo Yiannopoulos is the latest in a glorious line of fiendish gay dandies who act as the jesters, contrarians, and provocateurs of Western society. Realizing that the regressive left is the most ridiculous thing today's society has to offer, he uses his talents to ridicule it to no end. In what should be seen as a continuous piece of performance art, he goes into the biggest strongholds of liberal academia, and gives speeches that trigger regressive students to act in ways that expose the absurdity for the world to see. But when he recently tried to speak at Berkeley, the event was shut down by violent protests, and here's how they justified it.
You did a bunch of interviews after and you were asked about this, and you were, to your credit, I think, very straightforward about it and unapologetic, and you said, yeah, this guy was a fascist, Milo's a fascist, and we shut him down. You didn't pretend otherwise. We shut him down, and that's what you do with fascists. I think I'm characterizing what you said correctly. Just so we can understand the standard here, what is a fascist?
So a fascist is someone who's organizing a mass movement that's attacking women, immigrants, black people, other minority groups in a movement of genocide. That's what a fascist is.
Okay. So it's someone who's committing violence?
And it's someone who's committing violence and who's trying to organize other people to commit violence.
So Milo is a fascist, and therefore punchable, by regressive logic. Is he doing all the things that they accuse him of, though? Does he at least support the white nationalism of Richard Spencer and the alt-right? When asked about it, here's what he had to say.
Don't fight identity politics with identity politics. White pride, white nationalism, white supremacy isn't the way to go. The way to go is reminding them and yourselves that you should be aspiring to values and to ideas. You should be focusing on what unites people, not what drives them apart. And you shouldn't give a shit about skin color, you shouldn't give a shit about sexuality, you shouldn't give a shit about gender, and you should be deeply suspicious of the people who do.
So it sounds like Milo wants the same thing that the regressive claim that they want. A society that does not judge and oppress people based on their identity. In many ways, Milo is the symbol for the complete victory of liberal identity politics. He is a gay Jew who dates black men, and yet is still accepted and beloved by conservatives. This is the world that we wanted. So why do they protest against him? Because, bound by dialectic thinking, they don't believe such a society is possible before the patriarchy is overthrown. Only after the oppressed class takes control, and imposes its general will, can equality and unity prevail. Milo, by suggesting that this can happen without a revolution, is going against what they believe to be the general will, and therefore is a fascist who promotes genocide, and should be violently shut down. This woman is Yvette Felarca, who is one of the leaders of an organization called By Any Means Necessary, or BAMN. The name speaks for itself. The organization, based in Berkeley, believes that it speaks for the general will, and can use any means necessary to try to impose it on the rest of society. Former activists are reporting that the organization is basically a cult, which young kids are lured into because they think that they are going to fight for human rights, but are then indoctrinated and intimidated into becoming soldiers for a Marxist revolution. BAMN, along with other radical groups like Antifa, have recently turned to violence to promote their cause. The next logical step is terrorism, and it seems to be only a matter of time before they take it. One may claim that such groups are just the fringe, and do not represent the regressive left. It's true that most regressives are not violent, but the question is, how do they react to the violence shown by these groups? Let's take one regressive as an example.
With the recent punching of white supremacist Richard Spencer and protesters shutting down scheduled appearances by racist, misogynist, professional internet troll Milo Yiannopoulos, I've heard many people arguing that the likes of Spencer and Yiannopoulos should be allowed to have their say, that their voices ought to be heard, so that if their claims are false or their rhetoric is harmful, we can respond in kind, with the truth, or with better ideas.
This is Steve Shives, who is pretty much the most perfect regressive you can think of. His YouTube channel is where you should go to, if you want to see how regressive logic can infest what was initially an intelligent mind, and warp it into a caricature. So, what is Steve's reply to the claim that we shouldn't use violence to suppress bad ideas?
My casual acquaintance Eli Bosnick made this point on Twitter a few days ago. Refuting bad ideas with good ideas is important, but so is removing bad ideas from the discourse. And when we refuse to do that, when we continue to engage with people pushing arguments that have already been refuted, we treat their bad ideas as though they were legitimate. Do they have the right to continue to speak in support of their bad ideas? Sure they do. Do they have the right to a platform to better enable them to disseminate those ideas? Absolutely not. Let them speak, but let it be from atop an apple crate on a street corner, not on a stage at a university or in front of a radio microphone or a television camera. We've heard what they have to say. Now it's time to stop indulging them so the rest of us can move forward.
Sounds familiar? Yep, it's a dustbin of history argument, dragged out of the dustbin of history for one more round, and used to justify the use of violence to prevent someone from having a platform. Steve refutes himself. For a while, we thought that we have outgrown this idea of dustbin of history, and understand how dangerous it is. By bringing it back, Steve demonstrates that no bad idea will ever be outgrown. They will always come back in a new guise, and we will have to defeat them yet again. But Steve believes in dialectic progress, believes that anyone who hasn't reached his level of progress is a hindrance, and should therefore be silenced. Like, for instance, YouTubers who disagree with him.
Babylon thought, hey Steve, if you could round up and kill every anti-SJW vlogger on YouTube, would you do it? No, of course not. I wouldn't want to kill anybody. If I had the power, I would ban all their channels. That's a no-brainer. If it were within my power to ban all of their YouTube channels, that I would do that in a heartbeat. Not because they disagree with me about something, which is sort of the common line. You know, SJWs, they can't stand disagreement. They just want to block everybody for disagreeing with them. No, it's because you're abusive assholes and you perpetuate bigotry and intolerance. And I don't think that YouTube should host you and enable you to do that. So if it were up to me, you would be history.
As we can see, Steve is virtue signaling, saying that he is against bigotry. That means that he is speaking in the name of the general will. Those who disagree with him are therefore against the general will, which means that they are against equality, and that makes them abusive bigots. Whereas he has virtue, and that gives him legitimacy to want to ban other YouTubers and destroy their livelihood. There is just one little problem. The people are not with Steve. The popularity of his channel is abysmal compared to those people he wants to ban. That raises a suspicion that the general will may not be what he thinks it is. But Steve's answer to that is that everybody else is simply wrong. They are brainwashed by the patriarchy, so they don't know what's good for them. They don't know what the general will is. He, on the other hand, does know. So like Robespierre, Lenin and their sort, he wants to impose his views on others. He probably believes that history will exonerate him, and remember him as someone who remained firm against the tide. Time will tell how history will judge Steve Shives and his cronies. As we have seen, those who claim to be on the right side of history are usually remembered as having been on the wrong side of it. The silver lining in all of this is that with this turn towards political violence, the regressive facade is going to be exposed. What I've been claiming all along in this series is that the number of people who actually believe in the radical left ideology is very small. In a postmodern world, we no longer believe in utopia, so radicals have lost the appeal they used to have, and have to disguise their utopian tendencies. Their political power relies on the passive regressives, those who don't realize that they are radicals. But these passive regressives will not go along with violence and terrorism, and they will not go along with people who defend it ideologically. So this will help them wake up and realize the true nature of the regressives. The bad side of this is that people are going to be harmed by the violence, and that is why we need to defeat the regressive left as soon as possible. This series is my humble contribution to this effort. And it shouldn't take long because, as we can see, these regressive SJWs are pathetic ghosts of the past. There is nothing original about them. They are an afterimage of a copy of a replica. They are diving deep into the dustbin of history and digging up the most putrid garbage it contains, ways of thinking that for a brief historical moment we thought that we have finally left behind. And that is why they are the regressive left.